He fired those words off before she even let go of her bag. Right out on the dusty street, with half of Millhaven gawking, the sheriff, the banker, and those church ladies wearing their tight, hungry little grins. Garrett Vance watched the most stunning woman he had ever laid eyes on step down from that stagecoach, and the very first words out of his mouth were, "There's been a mistake. A woman like you. You cannot be my wife." Ada Finch didn't bat an eye. She didn't spare the crowd one single look. She just held out her gloved hand, met his cold stare, and said, real soft, "You're not what I expected either, Mr. Vance." That dead quiet lasted 3 seconds, but it sure felt like 3 long years. If this frontier tale already has you hooked, hit that subscribe button right now. Ring that notification bell and ride along with us until the bitter end. Leave a comment with your hometown or state below. I want to know just how far across the map this western yarn is traveling. Let us step back into that dusty Millhaven street together, Montana territory, and see what really went down when Ada arrived. That Billings stagecoach ran 40 minutes behind schedule. Garrett Vance stood rooted beside his horse for over an hour, arms folded, jaw clenched tight. His brim pulled so low that any fella in Millhaven knew better than to cross him. He was not a man who welcomed chatter on a good day, and this was sure far from it. All around him the settlement did what small towns always do. It kept a close eye. Pearl Hutchins lingered outside the mercantile, with 2 ladies faking interest in some fabric she never planned to buy. Deputy Harlan Cole lounged way back in his jailhouse chair, boots propped up, thumbs tucked into his gun belt, smiling at absolutely nothing. Even Reverend Aldrich found a handy excuse to loiter right outside the local post office, one hand resting flat on his holy book like he was bracing for a storm. Every soul there knew exactly why Garrett Vance was holding down that street. Gossip spilled 3 weeks back, the exact way stories always leaked out in Millhaven, through Grace Feller at the telegraph wire catching the outgoing message. She whispered it to her sister, who naturally passed it right along to her husband, who ran his mouth down at the barber shop, and from there it spread like wildfire across dry prairie. Garrett Vance sent away for a mail-order bride. 41 years old, spending 5 hard winters on the Vance spread with nothing but longhorns and dead silence for company. The rough rancher who skipped every town dance since his fiancée, Margaret Hollis, left him high and dry at the altar for some fancy Denver railroad man. That exact man drafted a letter to a St. Louis matrimonial agency, placing an order for a wife. His letter, if you believed Grace Feller's snooping, was so downright blunt it bordered on offensive. Practical woman preferred. Plain features, acceptable, even desirable. Must be willing to work. No complaints about isolation. No expectations of sentiment. This is a working arrangement. The whole town chuckled, that quiet way folks laugh when they secretly pity a man. You and I know exactly why they all showed up to watch. That heavy coach rumbled around the far edge of Main Street, and Garrett stood taller. His big, gray quarter-horse fella named Colt grew restless under his grip. Garrett just patted the beast's neck once, kept his mouth shut, and waited. The dusty rig rolled to a halt. The driver hopped down and yanked the heavy door open. 2 fellas stepped out first. A greenhorn land surveyor Garrett didn't know, and old Pete Garfield returning from his daughter's place over in Billings. Then that door swung wide open, and the whole bustling street went dead quiet. She stepped out of that stagecoach exactly like a queen walking into a saloon she already held the deed to. It wasn't cheap arrogance, no sir. She moved with a quiet, deep-rooted kind of certainty, like a lady who knew her own worth, and sure did not care to explain her business to anybody who thought otherwise. She stood tall. Dark hair, eyes the color of strong black coffee, sharp as a hunting knife, taking in that whole muddy street in one slow, measured sweep. Wore a dark blue traveling dress, the hem caked in trail dust, and she carried one leather satchel, planting it on the dirt herself before the driver could even offer a hand. She was purely breathtaking. Now I want you to understand, Garrett Vance hadn't let himself think that about any woman in 5 long years, but he thought it right then, before he could stop himself. and then that familiar cold rushed right back in, flooding his heavy chest like ice-choked creek water in early March. No, absolutely not. This was all wrong. He walked straight toward her. Now gather round. Pearl dropped her cloth, and Deputy Cole's boots hit the porch floorboards real quick. Even the Reverend caught himself stepping closer to the drama. Garrett halted about 3 feet shy of her boots. She turned to face him. He met her gaze right back. He broke the quiet. "Miss Finch."
"Mr. Vance,"
she replied. Her voice didn't waver. Not warm, not icy, just dead steady. He stared at her for a long spell, letting that heavy silence do the talking for him. Then he finally spoke up. Right out loud, in front of the whole town. "There has been a mistake." His tone was flat, packing no real malice, but offering no apologies either. "A woman like you just cannot be my wife." Not a single whisper rustled the crowd. Those townsfolk were too busy gawking. Ada Finch just watched him. She never glanced at the gawkers. She did not check her gripsack, nor her hands, nor the dusty street beneath her. She kept her eyes locked on Garrett Vance, and after 2 beats, she stuck out her right hand. "You ain't what I pictured either, Mr. Vance." He did not take that offered hand right away. The rancher stood rooted, his jaw working like a fella chewing on a tough piece of jerky he could not quite swallow. Then they shook. Her grip was iron, his was solid stone. Neither one was willing to let go. They finally released at the exact same second, like 2 unbroken mustangs recognizing the same raw stubbornness in each other without saying a single word. "My wagon is hitched around the side of the livery," he muttered. "I figured you did not hike here," she replied. He spun and walked. She hefted her bag and followed. Behind them, the whole frontier town breathed again. Heading out to the Vance homestead took 45 minutes if the dirt trail was dry, but today that trail was half-frozen mud, with ruts deep enough to snap an ankle, and Garrett pushed that team like he did everything else, hard, straight, and silent. Ada rode shotgun, gripsack at her boots, and hands folded primly in her lap, watching that vast western frontier sprawl out wide around them. You and I both know Montana in late October ain't beautiful in any soft, welcoming kind of way. It was endless, trapped under gray skies, and brutally unforgiving. Just miles of frosted prairie and bare cottonwoods tracing the frozen creek beds. To the north, mountains wore their first heavy snow, like old men hunched against a blizzard. It was the sort of wild country that never cared if you were ready. It simply existed, and you either toughed it out or perished. They rode for miles in absolute silence. Finally, Ada spoke up. "How long have you worked this claim?" 12 years. Garrett muttered without turning. "And alone for how long?" A heavy pause. 5. What went wrong 5 years back? That jaw muscle ticked again. "Not your concern." "Well, I am about to live on your homestead and take your name," she replied, without any anger. "I reckon that makes most things my business sooner or later." He shot her a quick sideways glance, the exact look a proud cowboy gives when he is caught off guard, but refuses to admit he is impressed. "The gal I aimed to marry," he finally grumbled, changed her mind. "I am sorry." "Don't be. It was a lifetime ago." "Folks only say that about wounds that are still fresh," Ada pointed out. The buckboard slammed a rut, jolting them both, yet neither reached for support. "So what about your story?" he asked, his tone carrying a sharp edge, not downright cruel, just testing her grit. "A refined lady from St. Louis looking like you do. Why write to a mail-order bride agency just to freeze on a wagon in Montana?" "The exact same thing that drives a man to write one," she answered back. Running completely out of better options, he stayed quiet for a long stretch. Then, out of nowhere, the corner of his mouth twitched. It wasn't quite a grin. Something much shorter and far more stubborn, but it was there. "The cabin ain't much," he muttered. "Figured I would warn you before you start complaining and I have to hear about it. I didn't come here for a fancy parlor, Then what did you come for? She stared at the harsh trail ahead, that endless sweep of frost-bitten prairie stretching to the ridge. She kept her eyes fixed on the dark shadow of a lonely ranch house appearing on the horizon. Picture this with me. A weathered gray cabin, flanked by an old barn and leaning wooden fences. Looking like a man gave up keeping it straight years back. I came for something real, she told him. He kept quiet. His eyes stayed fixed on that dusty trail, and that wagon kept right on rolling toward the old homestead. That cabin was barely standing. Built tough for frontier living, sure, but then left to slowly forget that a working shelter needs an awful lot of upkeep. Front step was split clean. That west-facing window was just patched over with a rough pine board. The kitchen table stood on 3 good legs and a raw chunk of fence post. Now Ada just drifted through that room without speaking a single solitary word. She swung the back door, eyed the dirt yard, and shut it. Checked the iron stove, the pump, and the bare bones in that larder. She rattled the cellar latch, marched upstairs to inspect both bedrooms, then marched right back down. Garrett just stood dead center in that kitchen, arms crossed tight, watching her work. Well, he muttered. Stovepipe needs sweeping before you light it, or we will have a chimney fire, she fired back. That pump seal is shot. You are losing pressure. That south pasture fence line I spotted from the east window needs fresh wire hung before the winter snow hits. And whoever patched that window used pine instead of cedar. That wood will rot right through by spring. A heavy, dead silence. You caught all that in 4 minutes, he said. I was raised on a working Virginia farm, she replied. My daddy had 4 girls and 0 boys. We all learned the ropes. He eyed her hard, wearing a look she could not quite figure. Half doubt, half something he was fighting to keep buried deep. That back room down the hall belongs to you, he finally said. Grub is your job starting tomorrow. Tonight you go rest. I am not tired, she said flatly. Where's the chimney brush? He just stared. Mr. Vance, she sighed. I just told you that pipe is clogged. If it needs sweeping, it gets done right now, not tomorrow. So where is that brush? Another quiet pause. He finally walked to the back closet, pulled out the wire brush, and handed it over. She snatched it, rolled her sleeves up tight, and got scrubbing. He leaned against that kitchen door frame, just watching her for a good long spell. Then he wandered outside, stood on that cracked step in the bitter cold, staring out at those rugged mountain peaks. 5 long years since another soul lived inside his cabin. Now you and I know, a man gets used to isolation. Hearing foreign kitchen noises stirred up a mighty strange feeling deep inside his chest. He did not care for it. Supper that evening was dead quiet, same as everything on the Vance spread had been for years. Only this was a different breed of silence than Garrett usually knew. His silence used to be hollow. This was heavy. There was the faint clink of someone else putting a tin plate down across the table, the harsh scrape of a wooden chair, the awkward hush of 2 strangers who haven't figured out how to talk yet. Ada had rustled up a meal from the scraps left in his pantry. Salt pork. Dried beans and cornbread she whipped together while he was out riding the herd. He never asked her to do it. She just took charge. He sat down across the timber, and they ate. This cattle ranch is bleeding money, she announced halfway through their supper. He snapped his head up. Excuse me. Found your account ledger on the parlor shelf. Your math is completely off. Let's look at the facts together. You are running more steers than your hay can feed through a bitter winter, and your irrigation water tax shot up 40% lately. If this cold season drags out, you will be ruined by spring. She dropped her fork. I am not attacking you, just stating the plain facts. I know my own land, he growled. Then you know every word I said is gospel truth. He dropped his fork onto the table. Miss Finch. Ada. Ada. He choked out her name like it cost him blood. I ran this spread for 12 years. And I have been here 4 hours, she fired back. I know. I am not trying to boss you. I am calling it like I see it, so we can fix this together. That is exactly why I traveled out here. She paused. That is what a partner does. That heavy word dropped between them and just sat there. Garrett just stared at her across the table. Picture this. In the dim lamplight, her sleeves stayed rolled past the elbows, revealing a dark streak of chimney soot she hadn't even bothered scrubbing off her forearm. She didn't look much like that polished lady who first stepped off the stagecoach. No, she looked like a homesteader who already claimed this place, just waiting for the cowboy to finally catch up to the facts. "Where'd you study finances?" he finally asked. "I ran the ledgers for my father's farm since I was 16, she replied flatly. "Then I spent 2 years running accounts for a dry goods merchant back in St. Louis, right up until the doors closed." She picked her fork right back up. "Numbers never lie, Mr. Vance. People do. Numbers just sit there telling the cold truth whether you like it or not." The rancher fell dead quiet for a long moment. "Garrett," he muttered. She glanced right up. "If you're living out here," he told her, "might as well call me Garrett." A flicker crossed her face. Not quite a full smile, but a brief, subtle softening quickly hidden away. "All right," she answered. "Garrett." They finished that supper in dead silence, but the heavy frontier tension was finally gone. Well, he heard her stirring long before dawn. Coming downstairs, he found her dressed, the iron stove roaring, and her heavy winter coat already on. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "South fence line," she replied. "I need to walk it before the winter frost bites any deeper. If wires need restringing, I want to know today, not after a coyote takes our livestock." He stared hard. "That is 2 miles of fencing." "Then I should get moving," she said, walking out the heavy door. He stood alone in the kitchen for a moment. He poured a cup of her fresh coffee, sipping it by the window. He watched her cross the frosty yard in the gray dawn, marching toward the pasture with total purpose. He racked his mind, trying to remember the last time any man walked a fence line for him. He just couldn't. He dropped his cup, grabbed his old hat, and followed her. They walked that southern boundary line in total silence. Garrett pointed out the weak spots he knew about, while Ada spotted 3 more he had either completely missed or just grown way too blind to see. She had a razor-sharp eye. She never stared at the dirt the way most folks did. She walked tall, constantly scanning the wild terrain, noting and calculating. Down where the vast south pasture finally hit the timberline along the creek, she froze. "That's surveyor's post," she muttered, pointing squarely at a jagged wooden stake half buried in the freezing frontier dirt. "Is that our boundary marker?" "Should be," he replied. "Why?" She crouched low, studying it. "This stake is brand new," she declared. "The timber is barely weathered, and it sits 3 feet from the original post hole. Stick with me here." She pointed at a dark, sunken hole nearby. "Someone deliberately moved it." Garrett froze like a cornered beast. "Who owns the land across that creek?" she asked. The name slipped out, cold and hard, dripping with 5 bitter years of bad blood. "Barrett Drake." Ada stood tall, staring across the rushing creek at the rival rancher's territory, before locking her eyes back on the tampered stake. "You must have a survey map of this ranch," she reasoned. "Back at the homestead. We need to check that right now." She was already marching back home. Garrett lingered by the muddy creek bank for just another moment, glaring at the stolen ground and Drake's spread across the water. A bitter chill crept through his bones, completely unrelated to the harsh Montana frost. He always knew Barrett Drake craved his water rights. He felt that greed during every chat down at the local feed store, in every overly generous offer to buy his homestead, and every fake smile that held on a fraction too long. But he always brushed it off as rancher's paranoia, just a dusty old grudge, lacking any real bite. He eyed the stake again. 3 feet. Might sound small, but 3 feet down a whole fence line could swallow a water source. It shifts land before a judge, It turns a man's legal deed into a bitter dispute. Out west, Garrett Vance knew how disputes ended. Rich barons with slick lawyers walked away winners, while honest ranchers lost absolutely everything. He turned following Ada back up the grassy ridge. Only one day on this homestead, and she already spotted the trap he was simply too close to see. So what do you and I make of this? Her sharp instincts stung his pride in ways he couldn't name. But worse, it left him feeling dangerously close to relieved. Come sundown, they unrolled that old survey map across his kitchen table. Ada just studied it quietly for a good while, tracking those property lines with one finger, checking them against a little leather journal she'd been hauling around in her heavy winter coat all morning long. The original survey was filed in 1878, she said. That means there's a recorded copy at the county land office in Helena. That's 4 days writing, he said. I know. She stood up straight. Does your neighbor have a history of land disputes? He's never filed one against me, Garrett replied. But 3 years ago he pushed a similar claim against the Hartley family east of here. Small boundary issue ended up in a full property hearing. The Hartleys lost half their water rights and sold out to Drake 6 months later. Ada stayed quiet for a long second. Finally, she asked, And no one connected those two things. Small frontier town, Garrett told her. Folks see what they want. Drake employs most men in this whole valley. He gives heavy at church charms the ladies and throws the finest 4th of July party anywhere around. Folks don't look too close at a man buying them cold drinks. What about the local sheriff? Garrett stared right at her. The sheriff's brother-in-law rides for Drake. She took that hard truth without blinking, just swallowed it down and filed it away. Then she answered. All right, then we avoid the lawman for now. Not just yet. She snapped that notebook shut. First we ride to Helena and pull that old property deed. Then we know exactly what kind of snake we are stepping on before we make our move. We, he said. She met his eyes right then. Unless you'd rather ride this trail alone. He just looked back. You and I know Western men, right? Here was a woman he tried turning away just that morning, who already scrubbed his chimney and walked his fence. She even found a crooked boundary post, all within the first 12 hours of setting foot on his cattle ranch. And now here she stood at his own table talking about Helena land records like they had been fighting this war together for a decade. You do not have to tangle yourself up in this, he warned. Garrett? Her tone was steady as a rock. I am already involved. I live here now. Your fight is my fight. She paused, and something deep in her gaze turned dead serious and utterly still. That is how a partnership works. How it has to be, otherwise none of this works at all. He studied her for a long minute. Outside, that bitter wind rattled the timber walls, and somewhere far off in the blackness, a lone coyote howled and went dead quiet. All right, he finally agreed. We. She gave one firm nod, folding up that old ranch map with real care while he watched. Let's consider his pride for a second. That very morning, he stood in town and swore to every neighbor who knew his face that this tough woman couldn't be his wife. He remembered the exact way she stared back at him when he denied her not crying or throwing a fit. Just watching him. Measuring, like a pioneer woman who had already made her choice, simply waiting to see if he was smart enough to catch up to the truth. He grabbed his worn hat off the table. I'll go check the barn, he muttered. Good night, Garrett, she answered softly. He stepped out into that freezing Montana night, and for the first time in 5 long years, that ranch house behind him didn't feel so empty. Out in the barn, he spotted 3 broken things he'd meant to mend for months, but somehow kept ignoring. A busted tie-down ring on the back timber, a leaky horse trough he had been patching with old rags since late August, and a rotted roof plank letting in that bitter winter wind and sometimes driven snow. He just stood dead center in that barn, holding a kerosene lantern, taking a hard look at his own neglect. The real shock wasn't the run-down state of the place. It was how completely those flaws bothered him now, like he was seeing with fresh eyes. He fixed every single one before turning in. He never questioned why. Come sunrise, Ada beat him out of bed yet again. Now, you and I know a good ranch hand is rare. He found his accounting ledger open, a fresh page covered in her neat handwriting. Tight. Perfect columns of livestock figures with sharp little notes. She was working the iron stove, back turned, boots on, and already pushing hard. I reworked the cattle numbers for proper pasture rotation, she told him, without even looking back. You have 40 head of cattle grazing the north field that need pushing east before the hard freeze hits. That northern grass is already chewed down. They'll chew it down to mud before December, and it stays dead until May, he muttered, sitting heavy to eyeball her notes. The woman was dead right. You been doing this all night? He asked. Woke early. She slid a plate his way. I just think better when it's quiet. He stared at the grub eggs, salt pork, and fresh, scratch-made biscuits. He shot a glance up at her. You know you don't gotta cook. I am fully aware of that, she replied coolly. I chose to. He dug in. She took a seat opposite him, balancing her plate and an open journal. She kept right on scribbling while chewing a habit that should have felt mighty rude, but honestly didn't. She just looked like a frontier gal with too many heavy thoughts and nowhere near enough daylight left. I aim to head into town today, she announced. He squinted up. What for? Flour salt. The larder is running low, and a hard winter is coming. She paused. Plus, I need a look at the county clerk's land records. Should be a copy of the old irrigation cooperative's original charter. If that snake Drake is shifting property lines, he sure didn't start with yours. Garrett slowly lowered his fork. You reckon he's pulled this rustling before? I reckon a man doesn't get that slick the very first time he tries a cheat, she countered. He sat and chewed on that. He pondered the Hartley folks, their sweet grazing land east of the creek, and how they suddenly sold out and packed up for Billings, and how this whole dusty town of Millhaven suddenly stopped talking about it just a week later. Town won't be overly kind to you, he warned. She held his gaze dead level across that timber table. I was raised in a ragged settlement just like it, she said. I know exactly how the wind blows there. And she surely did. They rolled into Millhaven near 10 in the morning, and folks were already glaring before the wagon wheels even quit spinning. You and I know that feeling when a storm's brewing. Garrett felt it as a heavy shift in the air, a quiet staring that wasn't quite hostile, but wasn't friendly either. Pearl Hutchins spotted them across the dirt road, whispering something sour to the woman standing right beside her. Both women stared hard. Neither one offered a smile. Ada clammed right down from the buckboard, never even waiting for his helping hand. She dusted her coat and said, I'll meet you at the dry goods store in exactly 1 hour. You sure you don't want? I'm sure, she interrupted, strutting toward the county clerk's office like she owned the whole Western Territory. He watched her stride away, catching Deputy Cole eyeing him from the shadows. Garrett simply tugged his hat brim low and wandered off to get that squeaky wagon wheel checked down at the livery stable. 20 minutes later, Garrett was leaning against the hardware counter when Barrett Drake finally strolled in. The man was 53, broad-shouldered, with slick, silver hair, wore the kind of fine clothes that whispered big ranch money without having to shout it. He drifted through a room like creek water rolling downhill, finding the easiest path and landing exactly where he aimed to be every single time. Garrett, the man purred, extending a heavy hand. His tone sounded warm and easy, the voice of a fellow who spent decades making men feel safe, right up until the very second he decided to strike. Garrett took the grip. Barrett, heard you finally fetched yourself a bride. Drake smiled smooth. Quite a shock to this whole valley, I gotta admit. Good for you, friend. A man shouldn't weather this territory alone. Appreciate it, Garrett muttered. Mighty beautiful woman from what folks are whispering. The cattleman's smile held firm, but something dark shifted right behind his eyes like a deadly, slow-moving current dragging beneath calm river water. Traveled all the way from St. Louis. That's a fact. Funny thing about those delicate St. Louis ladies, Drake drawled, plucking a brass hinge off the counter and inspecting it like he hadn't a care. Soft city women. They ride out west with grand ideas about how the frontier operates. Takes just one brutal winter freeze to properly adjust those expectations. He dropped the hinge back on the wood. You holler if you need anything at all, Garrett. Settling into a fresh claim can get mighty complicated. I'm always willing to help out a neighbor. Now listen closely. Here, he delivered those friendly words while the true, venomous meaning was riding off in the exact opposite direction. I'll surely keep that in mind, Garrett replied. Drake patted his shoulder once, then swaggered right on out the door. Garrett leaned there at the counter, feeling a creeping chill settle on the back of his neck. It had absolutely nothing to do with the October wind. He was waiting at the dry goods mercantile when Ada finally pushed inside. And just from the iron set of that woman's jaw, he knew immediately that she had unearthed something big. Let me paint you a picture. She stayed completely silent until that wagon was packed and rolling toward the ranch. Even then, she waited till the dusty town faded behind them to speak up. That hardly boundary dispute, she said. I tracked down the original filing. The very surveyor who slapped that boundary challenge on the Hartleys was a fella named Creighton Dills. Based up in Helena? She paused. That exact same Creighton Dills signed and notarized the deed when the Hartleys sold out to Drake 6 months later. Garrett kept his eyes steady on the trail. One fella, 2 separate papers. One man, 2 documents, exactly 40 days apart. She turned his way. Garrett, land surveyors don't normally notarize the sales that follow. Those are 2 entirely different jobs with 2 mighty conflicting interests. Nobody looked close, Garrett muttered, because nobody out here knew they had to. She simply flipped open her leather journal. 2 other spreads in this valley got swallowed up by Drake over the past 8 years. I want to pull the property records for both. He shot her a look. You dug all that up in 1 hour at the office? I read mighty fast, and I knew exactly what I was hunting for. She stared at her notes. That clerk wasn't much help either. Older gent, right around 60 years old. When I asked for the papers, he claimed they were stored away and he'd have to send up to Helena for them. That means he'll blab to somebody that you were poking around. I know. Her calm tone actually rattled Garrett a bit. Let him talk. We've only peeked at public records, but we need to hustle because once Drake catches wind, the whole clock speeds up. Garrett halted the wagon right on the ridge overlooking their ranch, just sitting quiet for a long moment. He stared down at the front, homestead the barn, the fence stretching across the wild valley. 12 hard years of his life. His daddy's cattle brand burned into every single post. Ada, he breathed. She waited. If Drake is running some crooked real estate hustle, and I ain't swearing to it just yet, but folks who cross his path haven't fared too well out here. She met his eyes straight on. I know. I ain't saying this to chase you away, Garrett told her flatly. I'm telling you so you grasp exactly what you're stepping into. I stepped into it the second I climbed off that dusty stagecoach. She fired back. You didn't create this mess. Maybe not, but it belongs to us now, and I don't ever run from what is rightfully mine. She held his stare without blinking. Do you? He studied her face for a long, quiet minute. No, he grumbled. Then we've got an understanding. She cast her eyes back to the valley homestead. Drive on down, Garrett. We have cattle to herd and a smoky stovepipe to scrub. Feels like the chimney cap came loose. He almost argued. Instead, he swallowed his pride and drove the team downhill. Let's pause right here. You see, that evening, Pearl Hutchins showed up carrying molasses cookies, wearing the sharp look of a town gossip fishing for secrets disguised as sweet neighborly hospitality. Ada swung the door wide. Mrs. Hutchins? She offered politely. Come right in. Pearl bustled in, took a seat, grabbed some coffee, and spent 7 solid minutes jawing about weather, flower prices, and the good Reverend's Sunday preaching. Ada just listened, nodded, kept the coffee flowing, and held her tongue. Finally, Pearl leaned over the worn table. "We are all just burning with curiosity about you, sweetie. St. Louis is a mighty long trail. What drags a refined lady like you all the way out to rugged Montana?" "Garrett's letter," Ada answered plain. "Yes, but—" Pearl kept her fake smile plastered on with the iron discipline of a seasoned busybody. "A pretty gal with your obvious charm. Surely you had fine suitors back east." "I certainly did," Ada fired back. "But I chose this trail." "You must have been in a fierce rush to flee St. Louis," Pearl purred, leaving that accusation hanging in the air like a rusty fishing hook. Ada lifted her tin cup, stared Pearl dead in the eye over the rim, and flashed a genuine warm smile without a lick of worry. "Mrs. Hutchins," she drawled, "if you have a direct question, I will gladly answer it. Cutting to the chase saves everyone precious time." Pearl's jaw dropped open, then snapped right shut. "More coffee?" Ada offered sweetly. Pearl scurried out 20 minutes later, leaving those cookies behind. Folks, she looked exactly like a snooping hound that went hunting for rabbits and came home with nothing but muddy paws. Garrett had been standing silently in the shadows of the front room the whole time. When Ada finally turned back toward the kitchen, she found her cowboy waiting and froze. "Listen here. How long you been eavesdropping?" "Long enough," Garrett said. Ada started gathering up the coffee cups. "She'll run straight to her boss." "That would be Clara Drake, Garrett," muttered. "They share the same church pew." Ada put down the hardware, turning sharp. "Barrett Drake's wife." His wife, yeah. Clara's worked this land as long as Barrett. Quiet gal, stays hidden. Garrett paused. "Folks call her shy. I always figured she looked downright spooked, but nobody ever asks my opinion on it." Ada stood quiet, chewing on that. "What do you know about her?" "Not a lot. She rode in when Barrett bought the ranch maybe 20 years back. I've crossed paths with her mostly a dozen times. Always polite, mighty careful about the words she chooses." He shot her a look. "Why?" "Because a woman terrified of her own husband knows secrets," Ada reasoned. "And frightened women out here are generally way less loyal to their men than folks might reckon." She grabbed the tin cups again. "She might just be the most vital soul in this entire valley." Garrett just stared hard. "Go check the herd," she said, gentle enough. "I need to wash up and do some thinking." He walked out to the herd. He pondered on Clara how she always lingered 2 paces behind Barrett in the church house, flashing folks a smile that never quite reached those sad eyes. He realized he had always spotted that detail, buried it deep in his mind, and never once dug it back up. He marveled that Ada had only been out west 4 days, yet she was spotting truths he had been entirely blind to for years. It rattled him deep. Yet it grounded him, too. A mighty strange mix of feelings he did not rightly have a name for. He was crossing the dusty yard when he caught the sound of hooves. One lone rider tearing up the dirt road, moving way too fast for a friendly visit. Garrett stood his ground. By the time he made out the boy's face, his hand had naturally dropped to the heavy timber post beside him, not reaching for a gun, just grabbing something steady. It was Tommy Fitch, the 15-year-old boy of Harold Fitch, who managed the local feed store. Now, you and I know good boys with rough daddies often overcompensate, trying way too hard to fix broken things that were never their burden to carry. The kid yanked his Mustang to a sudden halt, gasping for breath. "Mr. Vance," the boy choked out. "My pa ordered me to stay away." "I rode over anyway." "Just catch your breath, Tommy," Garrett told him. The kid inhaled sharp. "Mr. Drake was at the supply post tonight. Him, my pa, and a couple drifters I didn't recognize. I wasn't supposed to be anywhere near there. I was out back counting stock, and they had no clue I was eavesdropping." Garrett kept his tone dead calm. What exactly did you hear? Mr. Drake claimed he was filing a land dispute against your property before this month ends. Tommy's voice was strung tighter than barbed wire. Said the court papers were already inked up and... The kid stumbled. He swore your new bride was going to be trouble. Said he needed to show the whole settlement her true colors before she stirred up any big ideas. That icy chill gripped Garrett's chest once more, cutting a whole lot deeper. He say anything else? Claimed his patience with you had run dry. Said this bitter winter was the perfect time to strike because... Tommy choked up. Because what, son? Because you would be completely distracted, Tommy whispered. Because of your woman. Garrett froze up like an oak tree. Finally, he rumbled, You did the brave thing riding here, Tommy. Head on home. Keep this quiet from your pa. The boy gave a firm nod, spurred his bronco, and vanished down the trail. Garrett turned his boots toward the cabin. He spotted the lantern glow burning in the kitchen glass. Ada's shadow drifting inside, likely putting the tin plates away, or poring over the ranch books, or scribbling in that little diary, keeping herself mighty useful like she always did. He chewed on Garrett Drake's wicked threat. She is going to be a major problem. He marched up to the porch, shoved the heavy door open, and crossed the threshold. Ada glanced up from the timber table. Sure enough, she was balancing the cattle ledgers. We gotta have some words, he grumbled. She read the danger instantly. What went wrong? So he spilled it all. Now I tell you, when he finished repeating that boy's warning, that kitchen went graveyard quiet. You and I have seen folks break out here, but Ada just leaned back. When she met his eyes, you didn't see a trace of fear. There wasn't any panic either, nor that deer-in-the-headlights stare folks get when they realize they just stepped into a trap they can't outrun. Just pure, ice-cold, razor-sharp anger. He said I was going to be a problem, she muttered. That's what Tommy told me. The room went dead silent. Good, she stated. Garrett just blinked at her. Good? He asked. Yes. She held his gaze, the lantern casting harsh shadows across her hardened frontier features. Because a man who considers you a problem is a man who takes you seriously, and a man who takes you seriously is a man you can actually fight. She stood tall and slammed the record book. Garrett Drake just told us exactly how terrified he really is. Garrett watched her. She had been on his ranch 4 days, warming a house left empty for 5 years, out in a valley that already wanted her gone. Now, she was staring down a cattle baron who had crushed outfits twice their size right then. Garrett felt a hard shift deep in his chest, a feeling he had not known in years. It wasn't warm, and it sure wasn't comforting. It felt like standing at the edge of a jagged canyon, only to realize your boots were planted solidly in the dirt. All right, he said. Then we fight. She gave a single nod. Then we fight. Outside, the bitter, unforgiving Montana night pressed hard against the timber walls of that ranch house. Inside, the table was buried under old land deeds, boundary surveys, and a cold mug of black coffee. 2 strangers, who didn't even trust each other yet, locked eyes, making a ruthless frontier pact that neither of them would ever dare walk away from. But you and I know the frontier always demands a heavy, brutal price. That heavy boundary dispute notice finally arrived on a Tuesday morning, exactly 6 days after Tommy Finch rode up with his twisted warnings. Garrett spotted the paper, hammered straight into his main gate right before the sun came up. It wasn't handed over by a sheriff or filed at the local courthouse. No. Out west, nailing a document to a man's fence in the dead of night is how you make sure the delivery feels like a loaded gun. He ripped it free, reading the ink while standing alone in the freezing morning air. It read, Notice of Boundary Dispute and Claim of Water Access Rights. Filed on behalf of Garrett Drake Land Holdings. The paper declared that the current eastern edge of Garrett Vance's sprawling property did not actually follow the surveyed line established back under the original 1874 territorial grant, and it also claimed those precious water rights Garrett held along the north tributary of Elk Creek were entirely illegal. They demanded a formal land hearing before County Judge Aldous Pemberton, with the trial date set within 30 days. Garrett marched right back inside. Ada was already sitting at the table nursing her brew and studying her journal. She took one look at his grim face and knew. "It's filed," she flatly said. "Nailed to my gate in the dark like a threat," he muttered. She took the sheet, scanned the legal jargon, and smoothed it flat. "Judge Pemberton," she stated. "Do you know him?" "I know his name well enough. He's been the county judge for 11 years. Never crossed him, but I don't know who pulls his strings." "I do," she replied. "I dug into the town records last week. He signed off on 2 of the last 3 ranches Drake ended up swallowing whole. He even finalized the Hartley land grab." She locked her eyes straight onto Garrett. "He's a bought man." The kitchen turned cemetery quiet. "Then we lose in his courtroom," Garrett said. "Not if we play by Drake's rules, no." She lifted her mug. "But the wild truth about corrupt men is they get lazy with paperwork, mostly because nobody out here ever makes them answer for it. They bank on folks turning a blind eye." She tapped that legal notice with one steady finger. "We're going to look real closely." "We have maybe 3 weeks before a gavel drops," he noted. "Then we have 3 weeks," she shot back. "Start with that Creighton-Dills connection. I need to dig up every single frontier survey he's stamped in this county going back 10 years. He dropped into a wooden chair. "That means Helena." "That means Helena," she nodded. "How fast can you make that ride?" 4 days out and back, if the weather doesn't turn sour." She nodded slowly. "Leave Thursday. I'll hold the ranch here." He looked directly at her. "You'll be completely alone." "I have been alone before," she told him. "You and I both know the frontier breeds tough folks." But the way she shut down that conversation carried a heavy, hidden weight. He knew better than to push it. She had secrets he could not quite trace. Come Thursday, he rode out to Helena. While he was riding the trail, trouble brewed back home. He only pieced together the real story later from Ada and Prairie Town Whispers. When he finally saw the full, ugly picture, the sheer danger of it made his hands shake. He never let anyone see that tremble. The spark caught at the Mercantile Friday morning. Ada walked in seeking lamp oil and sturdy wire. She had been mending her own boundary fences alone since Monday, like a proper pioneer woman. Standing right by the counter, she heard the whisper. Her own name drifted over, pitched perfectly loud by a stranger. Out west, you learned to spot that exact practiced tone. It was the deliberate drawl of a townsfolk gossip who desperately wanted her poison to be overheard. "I heard she was dismissed from a merchant's office in St. Louis. Embezzlement, they said. That is exactly why she couldn't find a husband. Had to use a matrimonial agency." The entire general store fell dead quiet. Every soul in there shifted. You know that sly, sideways glance folks give when they smell a saloon brawl brewing but want to look innocent. Slowly, Ada set her wire down. She faced her accuser. The speaker was 45, wearing fine city clothes, lingering by the fabric bolts with 2 local busybodies. She met Ada's stare with the bright, hungry look of a vulture circling a fresh kill. "I do not believe we have met," Ada said calmly. Her tone was smooth as prairie glass. The older woman raised her chin. "I am Agnes Tilbury. My husband sits on the town council." "Lovely," Ada answered. "Mrs. Tilbury, I'm going to ask you something directly. I expect a straight answer. Did you hear that from a reliable first-hand witness, or is it just trail dust?" "Gossip you chose to spit out in the middle of a public room." Old Agnes blinked hard. She never expected anyone to draw iron and challenge her head-on. Prairie gossips rarely do. "I heard it from whom?" Ada pressed. Dead silence. "I thought so." Ada casually grabbed her wire spool-dropped coins on the wooden counter and strolled out. "Stick with me here." 6 steps down the boardwalk, booted feet fell into step behind her. "Miss Finch?" Ada turned around. The lady tailing her was a small, pale woman around 45. She had that guarded, rigid stillness about her that outcasts and frontier survivors always recognize. It wasn't simple shyness. It was the frozen caution of someone who had spent grueling years avoiding the strike of a rattlesnake. "Mrs. Drake?" Ada greeted. Clara Drake shot a nervous glance down the dusty street. "Please do not say my name loudly," she pleaded. She kept her pitch low and perfectly level, like a poker player trained never to let their face twitch. "All right," Ada whispered back. "I have roughly 3 minutes before they expect me at the dry goods store," Clara warned. "So I am talking fast." She fixed Ada with eyes that were utterly exhausted and wary, but deep underneath that fear, a wild campfire sparked. Something she had buried for years was catching flame. That wicked story Agnes Tilbury told Barrett fed it to her. He penned it out and gave it to 4 town gossips 2 days ago. A totally fake record of your time in St. Louis built from scratch just to ruin you. Ada did not flinch once. "Why tell me?" Clara's jaw clenched hard. "Because I have watched him run 3 good families straight out of this valley. Honest homesteaders lost their land every single time, and I kept my mouth shut." She paused. "I am done staying quiet." "What exactly do you know?" Ada asked. "Way more than I should," Clara said. "More than is safe." She scanned the dusty trail nervously. "I cannot be seen talking to you. Not yet, anyway. But there is a hidden strongbox tucked inside the back closet of Barrett's private study. He thinks I never look. Land documents, blackmailed letters, fraudulent survey filings spanning 8 years. Her voice dropped to a wind's whisper. If someone grabbed that paper trail, his entire crooked empire would collapse. Every rotten piece of it. Ada stood dead quiet for 2 heartbeats. "How do I steal them?" "You do not," Clara declared. "I do." She backed away slowly. "This Sunday, Barrett attends early church, then eats breakfast at Fitch's with the councilman. He has gone 2 solid hours. I will have that box waiting." Her gaze locked with Ada's. I tell you, her icy mask shattered right there. What you and I would have seen underneath was pure, desperate pioneer grit. "Don't you be late." She turned and walked off. Ada just watched her. Now let me tell you, she headed for her wagon. She drove back to the ranch alone under a bleak Friday sky, wire spool in her lap, her sharp mind already plotting 3 moves ahead. Garrett rode back from Helena come Saturday evening. He stepped inside, chilled to the bone and covered in trail dust. He slammed a leather satchel right on the kitchen table, not even bothering to shed his coat. "Creighton Dills," he told her. "I dug up 11 survey filings bearing his signature in the county records, stretching back 9 whole years. 7 of those came right before Drake bought land. 3 involved boundary changes that pushed the fence lines straight into Drake's favor." Garrett opened the bag, spreading the papers out. And get this, he operates out of a Helena office funded entirely by a shiny new land development outfit. With Barrett Drake sitting as the top investor, Ada asked. Garrett stopped staring at her. "How did you know that?" "Because Clara Drake warned me Friday morning. Barrett's been running this dirty scheme for 8 long years." Ada spilled the whole story, the mercantile Barrett's vicious rumors about her past, meeting Clara on the boardwalk, and that hidden box of documents. When she wrapped up, Garrett was leaning hard over the table, hands flat on the wood. He stared at those papers, with a dark, heavy look she had never seen on his face before. Wasn't anger exactly something much older and quieter than that? "He targeted your good name," Garrett muttered, "way before they even scheduled the hearing." "He's smart," Ada replied. "If he poisons the town against me before the proof comes out, anything I say just gets tossed aside as the tall tale of a proven liar." She sat down. "It's a smart play. I would have done the same." He shot her a sharp look. "Not the lying part," she clarified quickly. "The timing killed the credibility. right before the evidence shows up. That is exactly what you do when the facts are against you. She cracked her journal open. It means he knows his own case is weak, which means we are riding down the exact right trail. Garrett shed his coat and sat. He stayed quiet a spell, just studying the documents. Then he said, "That wild story he spread about you, the embezzlement claim." "Pure fiction," she answered, not even looking up from her journal pages. "I know that." He said it so steady, no hesitation, no second-guessing, that it made her stop and look up. He watched her with that dead-on gaze. She knew that look. It was how Garrett Vance spoke the heavy truths he could not quite say out loud yet. "You really know that?" she asked. "Yeah," he said simply. "I truly do." She held his steady gaze for a heartbeat, then looked back down. "Sunday morning," she said. "Clara will have those papers ready." "I am riding with you," he replied. Clara said, "Keep out of sight. I am not letting you ride to Drake's property alone," he told her. It surely wasn't a friendly debate. Listen, here it wasn't negotiable. He spoke like a man who had made his mind up so rock solid that the only thing left to do was speak the sentence. She studied him for a long moment. Then she gave a nod. "Fair enough, wait at the creek crossing." I approached the house alone. Sunday morning rolled in under an iron-gray sky. That wind coming down off the northern range had some real nasty teeth to it. They rode out to Drake's spread in total silence. Once they hit that creek crossing, Garrett pulled back on the reins, and she rode on without looking back. Drake's place dwarfed the Vance ranch. 2 stories grand front porch, eastern kitchen garden. Clara was already waiting by the side door when Ada slipped around the corner. Clara moved fast, like a frightened woman who had practiced this handoff so many times that her body just took over before her mind could catch up. She shoved a heavy wooden box straight into Ada's hands. The thing weighed more than expected. "Every piece is inside," she said. Survey filings, copy letters to Dills, and then she just froze up. "And what else?" Ada asked. You and I could see Clara's hands trembling. Not wildly, she was far too controlled for that, but enough to notice. "There is a letter inside from Judge Pemberton," she said, "dated 2 long years ago. It spells out his crooked deal backing Barrett's land claims in exchange for $400 per ruling." She looked Ada in the eye. "If that letter gets out, this ain't just a boundary dispute anymore. Pure fraud and dirty judges." Ada gripped that box, locked eyes with Clara, and realized right then that the woman standing before her had just traded away something that put a real target on her back. "Clara," she warned quietly, "when this breaks wide open, and it will break, Barrett is going to know exactly where these papers came from." "Yes," Clara replied softly. "He sure is." "Do you have somewhere safe to hide?" Clara stayed dead quiet for a long moment. Then she finally spoke. "My sister in Bozeman. Been on my mind for 2 years." "Go to her," Ada urged, "before the land hearing. Don't be in this house when the storm hits." Clara stared back, and that iron composure she had worn for years finally began to shift. It did not shatter or break, but shifted, like an old barn door shut tight for years on rusty hinges. Until someone cranks the handle, the dusty air moves and sunlight bleeds inside. "Thank you," Clara whispered. The words came out harsh and ragged, like something buried deep in the dry dirt for a long lifetime. "Go," Ada warned. She spurred her horse back toward the creek crossing, tucking that box tight under her arm. Now you and I know a good horseman misses nothing. Garrett sat exactly where she left him, reading her troubled eyes before she even reached him, saying absolutely nothing. He just reached down, grabbed the box from her so she could manage her reins, gripping it tight with both hands as they loped back toward the ranch. They were halfway home when the heavy thunder of hooves coming up fast behind them made them both turn. Not a friendly face. The stranger pulled up hard, 20 feet back, a massive, thick-chested man straddling a gelding with a Drake brand scarred into its flank. He studied them for a second with flat, cold eyes. Not mad, not polite, just present like a hired gun, waiting for his exact moment to strike. Then he grunted, "Mr. Vance, Mr. Drake would like a word." Garrett kept his horse dead still. His voice came out completely level. "Tell Mr. Drake that if he's got something to say to me, he can say it at the land hearing." The rider's flat eyes flicked to the wooden box under Garrett's arm, just briefly, then back up. "Mr. Drake figured you might say that," the big man said. He reached deep into his heavy coat, pulled out a folded letter, and held it out. "He asked me to give you this." Garrett didn't even flinch. Ada leaned across the saddle and took the letter. She unfolded it, read the ink, and her face went dead still. "Garrett," she breathed. "What does it say?" She read it out loud, her voice flat and sharp. "Mr. Vance, I understand you recently acquired some personal property that does not belong to you. I am prepared to offer you a final, generous resolution. Sell the Vance Ranch to me at a fair market price. Vacate by spring, and I will withdraw the boundary dispute, ensuring no further complications arise for you or your wife. I have great respect for what your family built on that land. I would hate to see it lost over a stubborn misunderstanding that could have easily been avoided. Consider carefully. You have until Wednesday." The bitter Montana wind swept through the dry prairie grass along the road and said absolutely nothing. Garrett folded that letter, tucked it into his thick coat pocket, and stared dead at the Drake rider. "Tell your employer," he stated coldly, "that we'll see him at the hearing." The rider stared back at him for one long, heavy moment. Then he spurred his horse and rode back down the dusty trail. Ada watched the dust settle. Then she turned to Garrett. "He knows about the box." "He knows we have something," Garrett replied. "He doesn't know what's in it just yet, but he'll know soon enough." She stared down the empty road. "Wednesday. He gave us until Wednesday." "It's Sunday," Garrett muttered. "Then we have exactly 3 days to make this box count for something." She looked right at him. "Do you trust anyone in this county? A lawyer, a land agent, anybody with real standing who isn't bought by Drake?" Garrett thought hard on it. "Now, you and I both know how tight these frontier towns are." He thought hard, running through every single face in Millhaven, weighing every quiet handshake over 12 long years ranching this tough valley. Finally, he said, "There's a man named Burl Lattimore. He's a land attorney out of Billings. Not from around here, got no connections here. He handled my old man's title transfer 15 years ago, straight as they come. Can you reach him in 3 days? I can send a wire tonight." "Then do it," she demanded. "Right now, tonight." She looked at the heavy wooden box in his arms, then straight up at his weathered face. Her voice dropped low, the exact way folks speak when a truth is far bigger than the words themselves. "Garrett, this ain't just a simple boundary dispute anymore. You and I are stepping into a criminal mess. Judicial bribery, fake land surveys, and 3 ranch families robbed absolutely blind." She stared him down flat. "This ain't just about us keeping the cattle ranch. It ends with Barrett Drake facing a judge his money can't buy." Garrett studied her face. He'd worked that spread alone for 5 brutal years, surviving droughts, rotten cattle prices, and the quiet ache of a man who just quit expecting tomorrow to bring any good. Yet in all those lonely days, he'd never felt this. Wasn't quite hope. It was a feeling far tougher, sharp as rusty barbed wire, like finding boothold on granite after slipping on river ice. He tucked the box tight, grabbed his reins and muttered, "Let's ride." And ride they did. Back behind the ridge, a mean mountain storm was brewing black, the kind that boils up all day, hits like a hammer, and doesn't quit until the land surrenders. Burl Lattimore rolled in Monday night on the final stagecoach out of Billings, packing one beat-up leather briefcase and the calm swagger of a 30-year frontier lawyer. He'd stopped letting the chaos of the outside world shake him a long time ago. 60 years old, lean white hair, his cold gray eyes tracked over Clara's evidence box with the deadly focus of a scout reading a trail he'd walked 100 times before. The man read silent for 2 hours. Garrett and Ada held their breath across the kitchen table, listening to the iron stove pop. Outside, that brewing Sunday storm finally broke. Driving sleet hammered the glass in heavy waves, making that little ranch house feel like the last warm spot on earth. Finally. Lattimore set the final page down. "This here is the most airtight case of deliberate Western land fraud I've seen in 30 years of practice," he declared. His tone was dry as prairie dust, just like the papers he'd studied. "That Dills connection alone proves a dirty pattern, and the Pemberton letter, that's flat-out criminal conspiracy. The issue ain't whether you can beat them in court, it's where you choose to fight." "Meaning what, exactly?" Garrett asked. "Meaning, if you drag this before Judge Pemberton, he'll bury that bribery letter. You'd waste 18 months begging a district court that Drake already bought." The old lawyer eyed Ada. "But if we hit the state land commissioner up in Helena first, we freeze that county hearing dead in its tracks for a full state review. Drake loses his rigged hometown setup, and Pemberton's crooked gavel is yanked away entirely." Ada leaned in close. "How long does filing take? Writing hard, I can deliver it to Helena myself by Wednesday afternoon." Lattimore grabbed that Pemberton letter, giving the damning ink one last long stare. "This letter forces a mandatory state review. The rest of this box sparks a full-blown criminal investigation." "Drake's cutoff is Wednesday," Garrett reminded him. Lattimore peered over the rough paper. "Then Wednesday carries heavy freight for us all. How do you reach Helena alive?" Ada frowned. "What if Drake's men watch the roads?" "I ride out before dawn," Lattimore countered. "I'm just a gray Billings lawyer. Nobody in this lawless valley knows my face. I'm no target." He locked the papers inside that chest. "You two are the prey here. So between now and Wednesday, you hold down this fort. Stay away from town. And don't let any of Drake's hired guns smell what's in this box." Garrett locked eyes with Ada. She nodded sharp. "Go," Garrett agreed. "Before dawn." "You and I know that risk." Lattimore rode out at 4 in the morning, packing Ada's handwritten copies, leaving the real proof under Garrett's bunk. Those legal copies stayed dry in his satchel, while freezing sleet buried his wagon ruts long before the sun ever woke up. Tuesday stretched out into the longest, meanest day Garrett had endured since Margaret Hollis left him standing at the altar. He checked the cattle twice, mended 3 snapped fence posts, chopped enough firewood to beat February, and kept finding his boots rooted by the kitchen glass staring down that dirt road without knowing why. Ada kept right beside him. Pushing cows, stitching leather harnesses, doing the ledger math, quiet and sharp, making silence feel like a loaded gun. We've all felt that dread. At noon, she served him, saying, "You're watching the road." She nodded. "I know. Steering won't make Lattimore ride any faster." "I know that too," he muttered. She took a seat across the table. "Garrett, talk to me. You and I know this rough life." 5 years, he told her. "I kept this spread breathing by expecting absolutely nothing from it but bare survival," he warned her. "Never love the harsh land too much. Don't let anything matter beyond what your own 2 hands can control." He fell dead quiet. "Then you showed up. In 3 short weeks. You've handed me more to lose than I've had in 5 rough years." She sat motionless across the wood table. "That is not a complaint," he said. His voice came out jagged, holding a grit he surely had not aimed for. He sighed. "I'm saying it out loud because it's true. She held his gaze with steady, dark, coffee eyes. Out here, folks understand what she said next. I know how it feels building a life small enough to protect. She meant a life small enough to survive when it shatters. She fell silent. I did exactly that for 3 years in St. Louis. Right after my father passed, the homestead sold, and my entire world just blew away. She kept herself mighty small, deeply careful, and entirely alone. A shadow crossed her face. Not pure sorrow, just the heavy ghost of it. It works until you realize simply surviving ain't the same as living. He studied her face. The iron stove ticked with heat. Outside, the harsh sleet quit leaving the frontier quiet and buried under white snow. What was his name? Garrett asked. She just blinked. Whose name? The fellow who made you decide St. Louis was not worth staying for. The quiet stretched out. Then her mouth twitched. It was that tight, reluctant shape a person makes right before a genuine smile breaks through the dust. His name was Robert Aldgate, she murmured. A merchant's boy, awful charming. He just wanted a pretty, quiet wife to sit pretty and keep her opinions entirely to herself. She lifted her tin coffee cup. We were poorly matched. Man was a fool, Garrett grumbled. She looked right at him, and he held his ground. Neither of them blinked. Yes, she finally whispered. He really was. Out west, you and I know trouble knocks loud. At 3 that afternoon, a heavy fist hammered the wood, demanding entry. Garrett swung the heavy door wide. Barrett Drake stood on the porch, with 2 hired guns flanking him. He wore a sharp smile that held absolutely zero warmth inside it. Garrett, the Baron purred. Mind if we step inside? Yes, Garrett said. I surely do mind. Drake kept smiling. Your lawyer friend rode out before dawn, making tracks toward Helena, I reckon. He studied Garrett's weathered face for any flinch, catching nothing. Drake leaned closer. Whatever wild hope you found, it will not matter in this county. He scoffed. Not with our judge. All you are doing is making this ranch dispute far bloodier and more expensive than it ever needs to be. Then why are you standing here? Garrett challenged. Drake's slick smile slipped 1 degree. Because I respect the cattle empire your old man built. I would rather see you ride, off with silver in your pocket, than absolutely nothing. The man waited. He stared hard. Your wife found papers belonging to me. I want them returned. I have no clue what you mean, Garrett shot back. Drake, my answer is the exact same as Sunday. Garrett growled. We will see you at the hearing. Drake stared the rancher down for a long spell. That pleasant mask vanished. Underneath sat a cold, flat certainty. It was the dangerous look of a man who has never lost a fight, unable to imagine today going any different. You better think mighty carefully, he warned, about what you are protecting, and if it's worth the blood. I think on it every single day, Garrett replied, slamming the door. He rested his rough hand against the timber frame, listening to those 3 horses trudge back down the dirt road before he finally took a deep breath. Right. Behind him, Ada whispered, He knows Lattimore rode for Helena. He knows, Garrett agreed, but he does not know if the lawyer made it or what papers he filed. That is his one blind spot. Then we wait, she said. Stick with me here. Because Wednesday broke like any bad day does, looking perfectly normal until the ugly details slowly add up. The lawyer's wire arrived past 8. Ada read the message inside the Millhaven telegraph office. She rode into town before sunrise, facing a young telegraph operator named Davis across the counter. A fellow with 0 ties to Drake, who handed her that wire looking like a man who understood absolutely nothing and had been paid mighty well to keep his mouth shut. The wire read clear. Filed. State review ordered. Pemberton suspended. Land Commissioner brings in an independent hearing officer. Hearing reset. Friday 10 in the morning. County Courthouse. Come ready. B.L. She folded it, tucked it deep in her coat, and walked to her wagon. Dead still. In this frontier life, when news hits that heavy, your mind takes several seconds just to catch up. Then she let out one hard breath, trembling for the only time all week she allowed herself to break. Then she snapped the reins and headed home. Let me tell you, those 2 days before Friday passed mighty strange. Out west, time plays tricks when a storm is brewing, making every little chore feel heavy. Drake fired back on Thursday morning, and he hit them with 3 brutal strikes all at once. The Millhaven Courier ran a nasty piece claiming Ada Finch Vance was investigated for pure fraud back in St. Louis. Down on the south pasture, someone ripped out 2 of Garrett's fence posts and tossed them in the creek. And old Pearl Hutchins knocked on 3 different doors in town, spreading gossip that this whole land fight was stirred up by some wicked outsider who tricked a lonely cowboy into a fake marriage. Garrett caught wind of all 3 attacks by midday. The man stayed quiet as a tomb. Later that afternoon, dust kicked up on the trail. A wagon approached. Garrett stepped outside, having no earthly idea who was visiting. Turned out to be a stranger. A sturdy, middle-aged woman with a face carved from stone, hauling an older couple in her wagon bed. "I am Margaret Foss," the woman said, climbing down. "I was Helen Hartley's neighbor. Helen moved up to Billings, but she wrote me 3 days ago saying Ada Vance was digging into our old boundary dispute, and if a land fight was brewing, I needed to pack up and come." She stared Garrett straight in the eye. "I saw what Drake did to that poor family. I kept my mouth shut because I was terrified." She paused. "These folks here are the Dunleys. They lost 40 acres to Drake in 1881. They stayed quiet too." Her jaw locked tight. "We are done the hiding." Garrett stood there, taking them all in for one long minute. Then he nodded. "Come on inside." When Friday morning hit, that Millhaven courthouse was packed tighter than it had been in 11 years. Folks lined the walls, sat on windowsills, and jammed the doorway. You see, this Vance case wasn't just about fences anymore. You and I know the whole valley felt the weight of it, even without understanding why. The state land commissioner sent down a tough hearing officer who went by Graves 50, built solid. And he wore a look that said he was here to do a job and didn't care about a damn thing except doing it by the book. Barrett Drake claimed a table with 2 slick Helena lawyers. He wore a sharp suit, his silver hair perfectly in place. He sat tall like a man holding all the winning cards. Garrett and Ada took the opposite side Lattimore parked between them. Ada wore plain frontier clothes, simple dark dress, hair pinned up. Not a lick of flash. She planned it that way on purpose. She wanted every soul in that room listening to her words, not staring at her outfit. Graves banged his gavel. Drake's top lawyer started off swinging, showing the boundary claim and survey papers. He dropped the Dill certification, claiming Vance had been stealing the river water for years. It was a slick, polished argument, backed by paperwork that looked strictly legal, unless you and I knew what Ada knew. Graves listened without moving a muscle. Then Lattimore stood up. "I would like to enter evidence," Lattimore announced. "These estate papers prove a coordinated 9-year pattern of fake land surveys between Barrett Drake and his licensed surveyor, a fella named Creighton Dills." Drake's lawyer shot to his feet like lightning. "Objection! The history of these papers is completely verified," Lattimore fired back. They were handed over freely by a local resident who knows exactly what is buried inside them. He slammed the heavy stack on the table. "Furthermore, I am submitting a letter from October 1879 bearing the ink signature of the former county matcher. You and I are dropping right into the fire here. A letter-proved judge. Pemberton took dirty money for rulings favoring the Drake Company. The whole place exploded. Not with shouting, folks were still trying to act decent in a courthouse, but a heavy murmur rolled through the room like a sudden tide. It was that sharp, collective gasp a frontier town makes when everyone suddenly realizes the dirty secret they'd all whispered about was actually dead true. Judge Graves cracked his gavel twice. Quiet fell. Drake sat frozen. The land baron kept his hands flat, his face blank. It was the deadly stillness of a cornered predator, working out his next move at lightning speed before the trap snapped shut. Then lawyer Lattimore spoke up. I also call to the record Mrs. Margaret Foss and the Dunleys, who have provided sworn papers showing exactly how. Drake stole their neighboring ranches, using those exact same crooked boundary lines back in 1881 and 1883. Drake's high-priced lawyer leaned over and muttered something real quick into his ear. Drake gave one sharp shake of his head. Up high, Graves studied the dirty letter, read it twice over. His face stayed like stone, but his shoulders squared up with the heavy weight of absolute certainty. Mr. Drake, the judge rumbled, I'm going to ask you directly. Is this your signature on these letters with Judge Pemberton? Drake's attorney jumped straight up. My client declines. You sure can decline to answer, Graves said, never looking up. But I will put that refusal in the official record, and the state commissioner can draw their own conclusions. He placed the paper down. The boundary claim against Garrett Vance is suspended until the state fully investigates these surveys and the corrupt judging mentioned right here in this letter. That made Drake stand up. A fatal mistake. This is manufactured, he snapped, his voice ringing out much harder and louder than he wanted. Garrett heard it right away. It was the very first time Barrett Drake ever let a single drop of real panic show through his armor. This woman, he aimed a finger at Ada. She is a fraud. She came from nothing. She tricked a lonely rancher into marriage just so she could bleed him dry, and now she faked this evidence against me because she is exactly what I said. A cheap schemer. The whole courtroom went dead silent. Judge Graves just stared. It was the look of a man watching a gunslinger shoot himself in the foot, making a mental note of the blood. Ada did not even flinch. She stayed straight backed at that table, fixing Drake with a cold, steady gaze that held zero anger, zero fear, and absolutely no gloating. Just that same iron resolve she had shown Garrett Vance on a dusty frontier street 3 weeks back when he tried sending her packing, and she shook his hand anyway. Instead, Garrett was the one standing. He rose up slow, turning to face the townsfolk, the exact same people who had whispered those toxic rumors about his new wife, letting them seep through the valley like poisoned well water. And when he finally spoke, his deep voice was so flat and final, it shut down any argument. This woman, he declared, walked onto my ranch 3 weeks ago and dug up a fake survey stake on my fence line in 2 days flat. She spotted a dirty criminal trail in the county land records that I had been way too blind to catch for years. She tracked down the hard proof that saves my ranch, but also the rightful. Claims of every ripped-off family in this valley who gave up hope that anyone would ever stand up and fight back. He just paused. She has bled more for this land and this town in 3 weeks than half the folks sitting in this room have managed in 3 whole years. And I will not sit here letting a greedy thief who has robbed his own neighbors for a decade point a finger and call her a schemer. Then he sat down. The heavy silence hung there. Then from the side wall, Margaret Foss spoke up, bold as brass. That is right. You and I know this feeling. The room shifted. Not like in some cheap dime novel, but in that permanent, quiet way a real town changes, when good folks finally stop pretending they do not see the truth. The fancy lawyer grabbed his client's arm, but Drake stayed standing tall. He just stood there, arms slack, staring out at a valley he used to own outright through dirty money and high society rules, through 20 years of ruthless plotting. He watched his empire slipping right through his fingers, knowing damn well he could not stop the bleeding. Graves slammed the wood down again. This hearing is adjourned for state review. Everyone here will testify to the state commissioner within 2 weeks. You and I call that true frontier justice. He swept them legal papers off the table. Mr. Vance, your water rights and property boundaries remain in full legal standing until this review finishes and the final gavel falls. He stood up, vanished, and that courtroom suddenly stirred awake, buzzing like a kicked hornet's nest. Lawyer Lattimore leaned on over speaking mighty quiet to Garrett. The criminal investigation into Pemberton will take 3 to 6 months. Drake's lawyers are good, and they'll delay, but the land claim is dead. That man wouldn't ever recover from this in our county.
What about Clara?
Ada asked, equally quiet. She's in Bozeman, Lawyer Lattimore said. She sent a letter to the state commissioner's office directly before she left, detailing everything. 16 years of everything. He snapped his leather satchel shut. She's safer there than here, and considerably braver than most. Garrett shot Ada a look. She stared at that heavy door where Drake just marched out tight-lipped with his lawyers. She had that hollow, bone-tired expression of a rancher who just broke a wild bronc and is trying to remember how real rest feels. He reached right across that oak table, laying his rough hand over hers for the very first time. She stared down at it, then met his eyes. "It's not over," she said. "No," he replied. "But it's different now." She flipped her palm up, locking her fingers tight around his, and holding on for just a brief moment, just long enough to forge a real bond, before she squared her shoulders in that chair and let go. But you and I both know the whole courtroom saw it. They stepped out of that dusty courthouse side by side, keeping quiet for a spell because words just weren't necessary anymore. The biting frontier wind hit them head-on. Garrett held that heavy door as Ada passed through, stepping onto the stone stairs. The whole dusty stretch of Millhaven's Main Street laid out right before them, looking plain and quiet, same as always. But under the surface, the very dirt of that town had shifted in some deep, permanent way. Pearl Hutchins stood across the dirt street. She spotted them both. She didn't dart her eyes away fast, like guilty folks do when caught with a hand in the till. She held Ada's stare for 3 heavy heartbeats, then gave a stiff nod. No apology, no friendly warmth, just plain respect, and kept walking. Ada figured that was likely the closest to grace that hard woman could muster. She'd gladly take it. Lattimore shook Garrett's hand on those courthouse steps and said, "The state commission will move slowly. Expect 6 months minimum before a final ruling on the criminal matter. But your land is entirely secure. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." "What happens to Drake?" Garrett asked him. "That depends on how good his lawyers are, and how much the state commissioner wants to make an example." Lattimore picked up his leather satchel. "But a man whose surveyor is facing serious fraud charges, whose bought judge is under investigation for bribery, and who has 3 additional families now willing to testify against him, doesn't come out of that mess in any position resembling the powerful one he's in today." He looked straight at Ada. "That box you got from Clara Drake was the whole case. Without it, we only had a theory. With it, we had a solid prosecution." "She took the real risk," Ada said, "not us." "She truly did," Lattimore agreed. "I hope she knows it mattered." He tipped his wide-brimmed hat and wandered off to find his horse. They made it halfway to their wagon when Deputy Cole stepped right off the boardwalk, blocking their path. Garrett's hand drifted just a hair. Not reaching for iron, mind you, just shifting his weight. A coiled readiness. Stopping completely when he read that lawman's troubled face. "Now stick with me here." Cole looked mighty uncomfortable, wearing the sour look of a man who rode for the wrong brand for weeks, deciding whether to own up or just walk past hoping nobody calls out his sins. He locked his eyes on Ada. "Ma'am," he said, "I owe you an apology for not—" He stopped dead. He started over. "For not asking harder questions about some dark things I really should have asked harder questions about." Ada stared him down flatly. "Why didn't you—" That blunt directness landed on the deputy like a physical blow. "Drake employs half this town in one way or another," he muttered heavily. "My brother-in-law, my wife's cousins." It felt like pulling a thread on a sweater I desperately needed to keep wearing. "And now?" She pressed him. He stayed completely quiet for a long moment. "Now I reckon I need a different sweater," he finally said. There was something mighty sorrowful in that sound. It was the raw truth of a fellow who finally quit lying to himself, standing there entirely unsure how to handle that strange new weight. "That's a start," she said, tipping her chin and walking off. The wagon ride back to the ranch held a brand new kind of quiet between them. This wasn't the cautious hush of two strangers circling each other, nor the bitter, heavy quiet of a couple locked in a standoff. It was the deep, grounded stillness of two folks who survived the fire together, breathing easy on the other side, without needing words to prove it. Halfway down that dusty road, Garrett finally spoke. "You aren't going to say it." She cut him a sideways look. "Say what?" "That you told me so." She fixed her eyes on the trail. "I never once believed you were wrong about your land. I just reckoned you needed a steady hand to help you see it straight. Mighty generous for a man who publicly declared you couldn't be his wife." "You were terrified," she countered smoothly, "and terrified men say foolish things." "That is also mighty generous." "I am a generous woman," she replied. Right there, a genuine, slow-burning smile broke across her face. A real smile she had kept hidden from the whole town, the kind reserved for quiet, pre-dawn kitchens, and those tough, truthful talks by the glow of a lantern. It showed that rare comfort of truly being seen by another soul, without losing a single ounce of your spirit. Garrett watched that warmth reach her eyes, and a tight, heavy knot in his chest finally unspooled into the open air. He kept quiet, just nudged the team of horses to shift the wagon nearer to her side. She stayed exactly right there. The following weeks found their own steady rhythm. The state's investigation pushed forward exactly the way Lattimore had called it. It marched slowly, methodically. It had the cold, unstoppable momentum of a massive bureaucracy grinding through a mountain of undeniable proof. Official letters arrived, got answered, got filed. Drake's attorneys stalled the only way attorneys do, tossing out endless motions, continuances, and every legal trick in the book. But you and I know the truth. That claim against Vance Ranch was dead as dust, and the whole valley knew it. The kind of quiet trailing Barrett Drake shifted. It was no longer the confident, powerful hush of a man backed by his town. It turned into a brittle, cornered silence. The sound of neighbors standing back, just waiting to see how hard he would crash. Come November, Creighton Dills surrendered his surveying license rather than face the music from the state board. Judge Pemberton stepped down quietly that same week, blaming poor health. Nobody believed his letter, but they all nodded along because it conveniently swept a big problem out the door. Meanwhile, 3 desperate families who sold their acreage to Drake under pressure filed civil lawsuits through Lattimore's office up in Billings. 2 of them held claims, strong enough to claw back some hard-earned compensation. Garrett sat shoulder to shoulder with them at his kitchen table, helping map out the lawyer's demands. Ada poured the black coffee, maintained the ledgers, and spoke steadying words right when they were needed most. Neither one made a fuss about helping out, and they certainly never expected a lick of praise. The settlement slowly came around the way frontier towns do. It wasn't some grand theatrical turning point in the street. It happened through tiny shifts. Agnes Tilbury finally quit whispering that old St. Louis rumor. Pearl Hutchins started folding Ada into the vital pioneer grapevine. Suddenly, she knew who sold cheap hay, which mountain pass was flooded out, and exactly when the traveling doctor would arrive. No, it wasn't outright friendship. It was that gritty working respect folks on the edge of the wild give to capable strangers once they finally realize that newcomer is putting down roots and holding their own. After her 3rd Sunday church service, Reverend Aldridge blocked Ada's path and muttered rather stiffly, "I surely should have stepped up and welcomed you properly the day you hit this valley, Mrs. Vance. I truly regret that I failed." Ada met his eyes squarely. You can settle that debt by saying exactly that to the next stranger who rides into town and gets treated like a burden before they even get to prove their humanity. The Reverend blinked. I'll do that, he promised, looking downright stunned to realize he actually meant every word. A letter from Clara arrived mid-November, and it broke Ada down in a way those vicious rumors, the hearing and the courtroom threats never managed to do. It shattered her armor. You and I know letters like this, 3 pages penned in the careful hand of a woman who weighed every single word before spilling ink. Clara described Bozeman, her sister's cabin, and the sheer blessing of sleeping through the night without desperately listening for heavy footsteps. Gather round. She wrote about waking up on the 3rd morning. For 2 solid hours she realized she had not worried once about what words she was allowed to speak. That freedom hit hard. She wrote about fixing her own morning coffee, picking her own clothes, and wandering alone under the high noon sun without answering to a single soul. And then the words shifted. I spent 16 long years terrified of a man who knew a hard frontier truth. A woman with no place to run and nobody to trust is a woman easily broken and controlled. You rode into this valley blind, nobody knowing your name, and you looked that control right in the eye and flat out refused it. I want my little nieces to grow up knowing that survival is possible. Hell, I want to know it myself. Thank you for proving a woman can walk into a stranger's parlor and claim the space entirely through the sheer iron of her own damn choices. You did exactly that. I watched you pull it off. It was the most useful lesson I have ever witnessed. Ada read those words at the pine table that Tuesday morning while Garrett was working dirt out in the yard. She read the ink once over. Then she smoothed it flat, pressed both palms against the paper, and just sat there. Eyes shut tight, her breathing quiet as a frozen creek. When Garrett stepped back inside, she stood facing the stove. Her back was turned, but her shoulders were carrying a silent tension he had never seen in her before. No dramatic shaking, just bearing a heavy load she was trying hard to manage. He stepped in, pulled off his dusty hat, and held his tongue. He poured black coffee, took a seat at the table, and waited. After a beat, she finally turned. Her eyes were bone dry, her face held steady, but there was a rawness at the edges, like a dry riverbed right after a flash flood tears through. She slid the paper across the wood. Garrett read it. He read the whole painful thing without lifting his eyes once. When he finished, he laid it flat, folded his calloused hands over the page, and stared at the grain for a minute. Then he looked up at her. His voice came out deep, like rolling thunder. She is right, he told her. Every single word. Ada wrapped her fingers around her tin cup and met his gaze. I wasn't brave, she said plain. I was furious. Bravery takes a choice. What I was doing back then was mostly just... She cut herself off. I was just so damn angry he thought he could steal from you, figuring nobody would ever call him out. I kept thinking, this coward is banking on everyone being too scared to look him in the eye. Her jaw locked tight at the bitter memory. I despise a man who builds his life on other folks' fear. I know, Garrett replied. Then after a heavy beat, I was counting on it too, just in a different way. I spent 5 years hoping folks wouldn't look close, enough to see my mind was barely holding the reins together. He slowly spun his cup. But you stared me down from the very first second, right there in the dirt street, when I said that completely unforgivable thing. She gave a slight shake of her head. Not unforgivable. Ada, it was just honest, she said softly. You looked at me and figured I did not belong in this rough life you built. That ain't cruelty, Garrett. That's fear. And fear is forgivable. She paused. What mattered was the rough trail we rode after. Garrett sat quiet for a long stretch. Just the stove fire crackling, the clock ticking, and the prairie wind howling outside. You and I know those sounds. A frontier cabin dead quiet for 5 years, suddenly waking up with life again. I need to tell you a truth, he said. She just waited. I knew, he mumbled. Sometime that first week, maybe the second morning, you walked my fence line before the sun was even up. I knew that whatever I had requested in that damn letter to St. Louis, and whatever I thought I needed, or whatever lies I told myself about only wanting basic survival out here. He stopped dead and met her eyes. I knew I was already out of time. I was already. He chewed on the sentence a minute. He let the silence hang heavy in the air before spitting it out. I was already in love with you, and I spent the next 3 weeks being absolutely furious about it. The kitchen went dead still. Ada stared at the cowboy, and in her face, for the first time since they met, every last wall of Western stoicism, steadiness, and ironclad control shattered all at once. Not broken, friend. Just set aside. The way you and I finally drop a heavy saddle when we find a truly safe piece of ground to rest on. You were furious, she spoke, and her tone held something hovering right between a light chuckle and a quiet, ancient kind of gravity. Deeply furious, he muttered. I kept figuring I ordered up plain and practical. I asked for simple. I wanted a mail-order bride I couldn't possibly fall for, just so I wouldn't have to weather. He stopped dead right there. Then there you were, patching my chimney, walking my fences, and flat out telling me my ledger was dead wrong. A shadow crossed his weathered face, something that in a softer man you would probably just call helpless. I never stood a ghost of a chance. She studied him for a long, quiet minute. Then she finally told him, I reckon I loved you the very day you looked ashamed for hurting me. Out there on that dusty street, the harsh words had slipped out. You saw my face and you just couldn't reel them back in. She paused. You looked truly ashamed, not just embarrassed. Ashamed, like a man who knows his actions just fell miles short of the good fellow he really is. She held his steady gaze. Good men feel that heavy burden. They sense that wide gap between their true character and a foolish mistake, and it costs them dearly. You paid that heavy toll right there in front of the whole town, whether you realized it or not. She paused once again. That was the moment I knew you were worth sticking around for. He pushed back from the table. She held her ground. He crossed the old kitchen, stepped right up to her, and stared the way a fella looks at something he had feared facing head-on for years, until that old fear finally just burned clean away. He reached out, resting a calloused hand gently against her cheek. She brought her own hand up and held it there. That was it. And it was plenty. Outside, winter was dusting the Montana Valley. It started off light and searching, then turned steady and hard. That rough kind of November snowstorm that truly means business. Flakes settled on that boundary fence Ada had walked and patched up. It piled up on the south pasture right where they yanked that crooked stake and drove a true property marker 3 weeks back. It blanketed the high ridge and the creek edge. It covered that long, honest stretch of Vance ranch land, still exactly as vast as it always was. No more, no less belonging strictly to the rightful folks who earned it. Safe inside that old ranch house sat Garrett and Ada. He rested by the warm stove, the ranch ledger resting between their joined hands. Their fingers laced over the table corner. For the first time in 5 long years, the heavy silence inside those walls did not feel empty. It was the quiet peace of 2 pioneers who fought a hard battle, earned their keep, and could finally just rest easy for one honest winter night. Now listen closely. 3 months later, the state commissioner's final ruling officially arrived. It cemented the Vance homestead's uncontested land and water rights, right as Drake's shady land syndicate got busted up by a strict court order, and 2 of the 3 families filed successful civil claims. That heavy news rode in via a Millhaven postal rider, carrying strict orders to deliver the envelopes straight out to their ranch. Garrett scanned the paper at his kitchen table. He passed it right to Ada. She read it, set it down, and met his eyes. "It is done," she whispered. "It is done," he replied. She gave one firm nod, the kind a rancher gives when a heavy chore is finally finished up and it is time to tackle the next dusty job. Then she warned him the east pasture needed another water trough before spring thaw. He just laughed. It was a deep, honest laugh. The kind rumbling out from a place totally loose and unguarded. The kind a cowboy lets out when he forgot he even knew how to smile. Then it bubbles up, and the sheer surprise of it brings a fresh kind of joy. She watched him with that genuinely warm, bright smile, a look that belonged strictly to him, to that cozy kitchen, and to nobody else out there. "I will build it next week," he offered. "We will build it," she corrected. Between you and me, that was how it ended. No grand sunset finale. Just a stubborn pioneer woman saying "we" like it was the most natural word on earth, and a rugged man who finally, completely believed her. He originally penned a desperate letter to a matrimonial agency. He requested a bride he couldn't possibly love, hoping to dodge that awful, paralyzing terror of losing a partner again. Instead, the frontier gave him a lady who marched right into his busted life, with her sleeves rolled tight, who mended what was shattered, brawled for what needed defending, and flat out refused to shrink herself down for anybody. He tried his hardest to chase her off on a public dirt road right in front of the whole bustling town. She shook his hand instead, and in that bold moment, Ada Finch Vance didn't just rescue his homestead, his water access, or his muddy reputation in a valley that sorely misjudged them. You and I know the real truth. She saved the one thing truly at risk from the start, the man himself. I'll tell you what, that was the whole story right there. And it was plenty more than enough for one lifetime, or one hard winter, for one sturdy cabin holding strong against the bitter Montana wind, sheltering two folks who finally found that rare spark they reckoned was gone forever. No soft campfire tale, no easy bargain, but the real, gritty truth, fought for and fiercely kept.